What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Was Nero truly a monstrosity? Rome experienced some of its greatest economic and cultural dynamism under Nero's rule, and yet he's called everything from a murderous psychopath to a depraved tyrant. Is it time to re-evaluate the legacy of this notorious emperor? Nero, the fifth and last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, is typically portrayed as a heartless tyrant and narcissist who ordered the murder of his own relatives to maintain power. The fact that this image prevails is not surprising. Classical sources depicted Nero as a tyrant who lived and ruled under the control of his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger, who was a depraved, oversexed, and erratic individual. But curiously, while the ancient authors focused on his ruthless egotism, the political propaganda of Nero's time also highlighted the emperor's clemency. Despite the systematic persecution of Christians and the extermination of dissidents by Nero's government, especially in its final years, the Roman Empire under Nero also experienced some of its greatest economic and cultural dynamism. An unworthy emperor. In the year AD, when Emperor Claudius died suddenly, 54, Nero succeeded him to the throne at only 16 years old, leapfrogging over other members of the Julio-Claudian ruling dynasty. Claudius had adopted Nero after marrying Nero's mother and Claudius's own niece, Agrippina the Younger. Claudius neglected his biological son Britannicus by naming Nero his heir, but Nero enjoyed popular favor and the Praetorian Guard's support. The fourth wife of Claudius, Agrippina, had pushed her son into first place. She had convinced Claudius to allow Nero to marry Claudius' daughter Octavia, and to adopt Nero in the year 53. According to accounts of ancient Roman writers, the following year, once Agrippina was confident Nero's succession was assured, she had Claudius poisoned. The ancient authors who depicted Agrippina as a murderess and framed Nero as a cruel tyrant may have had their own agendas. They resented the fact that Nero's bureaucratization of the imperial administration took power out of the hands of the senatorial class to which those authors belonged. His suppression of indirect taxes in AD 58 resulted in greater participation of the common people in trade, which also displeased the aristocracy. Because of these complaints, it's likely that ancient writers made up stories to discredit him. The sources say that Nero was responsible for dozens of murders, among other sins. While he, like many Roman emperors, undoubtedly caused deaths, many of the murders he is accused of seem improbable if the circumstances surrounding them are analyzed. For instance, Tacitus, a Roman historian, politician, and orator who wrote around AD 100, Nero murdered his half-brother Britannicus out of fear that Agrippina would form an alliance with him. Tacitus adds that Britannicus' dramatic death in the middle of dinner, while the other diners were in a commotion, was watched by Nero and his wife Octavia in silence. However, when this unfortunate dinner occurred in AD, Agrippina was at her most powerful at 55, and she had no reason to support a British government change. Historian Anthony Barrett of the University of British Columbia argues that, in fact, Britannicus died as a result of an epileptic seizure. Another gruesome episode attributed to Nero was the death of 400 people enslaved by the senator Lucius Pedanius Secundus. When one of them murdered Secundus, all 400 were sentenced to death. Some Romans rioted, demanding that the innocents be spared. Nero put an end to the rebellion and ordered the mass executions. Nero, on the other hand, merely enforced a law that had been passed by the Senate. And when some senators suggested that freedmen who had formerly been enslaved by Secundus be exiled from Rome as an additional measure of communal punishment, Nero refused. His position irritated the aristocracy, many of whom he had displaced from key positions in the imperial administration, replacing them with formerly enslaved freedmen in whom he placed his trust. Nero offered other examples of level-headed rule. Early in his reign, to avoid abuses of power by the sovereign and the Senate, he eliminated secret trials held intra cubiculum principis, literally inside the prince's chamber, which involved the arbitrary condemnation or acquittal of a prisoner. In the time of Claudius, such private hearings were common, and the philosopher Seneca, Nero's former tutor and mentor, suggested that they be stopped. Popular with the plebs. By the age of 20, Nero had already forged his own political style and instituted judicial and fiscal reforms benefiting the common people plebeians. However, his political vision was hindered by Agrippina, his mother, who threatened to remove her son from power after eliminating all of her rivals. The first time that Agrippina was accused of plotting a coup d'état against her son, in AD 55, Nero displayed mercy. Agrippina had joined forces with rebellious Plautus, the rival of Nero and the great-grandson of Emperor Tiberius. Nero exiled others who were involved in the plot and forgave his mother and her accomplice. However, when Agrippina retaliated against her son 3 years later, one of Nero's advisors persuaded him to have her killed while presenting it as a maritime accident. According to Tacitus, it was the freedman Anicetus who dreamed up the boat plot, but senator and historian Cassius Dio wrote that Seneca and Nero came up with the idea together. In any case, Nero instructed his mother to sink the ship off the coast of Naples. Miraculously, Agrippina survived the shipwreck. Then, on March 23, 59 AD, she was finally murdered at her villa in Bali by Nero's cronies. It is said that a well-known comic actor bravely referenced the murder in a song. He sang "Farewell to thee, father. Farewell to thee, mother," while doing a mime of eating and swimming. Claudius had been poisoned while eating dinner, and Agrippina had narrowly escaped being drowned. Nero maintained a significant amount of popularity by providing the populace with bread and circuses, despite these scandalous events, which overshadowed his reign and detracted from his overall policy of clemency. But the support of the common people began to wane when Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful Pompeian woman, appeared on the scene. In AD 62, when Poppaea became pregnant several months into an adulterous relationship with Nero, the emperor decided to divorce his wife Octavia and marry Poppaea. To justify these actions, Nero accused Octavia of adultery with an enslaved person and exiled her to Campania, on the southwest coast. Outraged, the people began to destroy the public images of Poppaea in solidarity with the exiled empress. Nero was now determined to execute Octavia, but the revolt forced him to bring her back to Rome. Octavia was sent to the island of Pandateria following a second false accusation of adultery, this time against Nero's former accomplice Anicetus, commander of the Misenum fleet. There, some of the emperor's assassins murdered her by slashing her veins and immersing her in boiling water. The animosity the Roman people showed toward Poppaea wasn't shared in other parts of the empire. The imperial couple enjoyed widespread support in the region of Campania, where Poppaea was born in the city of Pompeii. On the walls of Pompeian houses destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79, archaeologists uncovered graffiti reading "Hail Nero, long live Poppaea" and "Hooray for the Emperor and Empress." In fact, there was more Pompeian graffiti in favor of Nero than for any previous emperor, and the messages remained visible even after Nero had been sentenced to damnatio memoriae, the removal of all his public and private images and inscriptions after his death. Nero's special popularity in Pompeii can be explained not only by Poppaea's Pompeian origin, but also by the favors that Nero granted the city. After an earthquake in 62 AD left Pompeii devastated, he helped the city recover and paid a personal visit to the Venus temple to offer sacrifices. By allowing Pompeians to return to their amphitheater earlier, Nero also gained popularity. Their games had been banned for 10 years, as punishment for a brawl that had broken out in the crowd at a gladiatorial contest when locals clashed violently with spectators from neighboring Nuceria. To cement the loyalty of the Pompeians, Nero reopened it after just 5 years. Not original according to ancient biographers, Nero's reign of violence grew more violent in the 60s AD. Conspiracies were fueled by ongoing conflict between the Senate and the emperor, and Nero increased surveillance. In AD 62, Ophonius Tigellinus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, led a successful team of spies who spied on and eliminated alleged conspirators. Accused of defaming Nero, the most dangerous rivals of the emperor met untimely deaths: Rubellius Plautus, Faustus Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, Seneca, and many of their co-conspirators. However, Nero's strategy of eliminating adversaries is very similar to that of his predecessors. Augustus, who was celebrated as a great emperor, was arguably as aggressive as Nero when it came to dealing with political opponents, ordering all the heirs of his rival Mark Antony killed, for example. The relationship an emperor had with the senatorial class of landowners, who wrote history determined whether he was regarded as a champion of the people or a bloodthirsty tyrant. While Augustus safeguarded the privileges of the aristocracy, Nero squeezed them. But the reputations of the two emperors were also shaped by their differing attitudes toward the culture, institutions, and deeply rooted customs of Rome. Nero, the pioneer, while Augustus maintained a very conservative policy regarding Roman traditions, Nero tried to replace them with new rituals inspired by Hellenistic culture, which he viewed as more civilized. It's possible to call Nero's changes a cultural revolution. To teach the new traditions, he built gymnasiums, arenas, and imperial schools where young aristocratic men were trained to compete in gymnastic and musical competitions that were part of Roman celebrations. The aristocracy generally rejected what they saw as cultural Neroism. They criticized his spectacles and poetry recitals, and they made fun of Nero as a narcissistic megalomaniac who became increasingly out of touch with the people he ruled and sought public acclaim through his zither playing and singing. Nero's costly attempt to have 6,000 prisoners dig a canal at Corinth marked the end of his reign. By 66 AD, things were falling apart. Mismanagement of the distribution of wheat and public finances led to an increase in discontent among the people, the army, and the senatorial class. Nero's long trip to Greece that year compounded the resentment. Against this background, Gaius Julius Vindex of Gaul and Servius Sulpicius Galba, Nero's soon-to-be successor, two provincial governors rebelled against him. In AD 68, Nero, now far removed from reality, reluctantly returned to Rome. The Praetorian Guard finally left Nero on June 8, as Galba's rebellion grew in strength. The emperor fled Rome with his trusted freedmen Phaon and Epaphroditus and his male lover Sporus. On June 9, the Senate sentenced Nero to death as a public enemy of the state. Nero made the decision to end his life because the punishment he received was death by beating with rods. He asked Epaphroditus to stab him in the neck with a dagger because he lacked the resolve to kill himself. Nero's suicide brought the Julio-Claudian dynasty to an end. One might anticipate that Rome would benefit from his death given his reputation. However, the year of the four emperors, a bloody civil war in which four potential rulers jostled for power from June 68 to December 69, was ushered in by the power vacuum that he left behind. It was, according to Tacitus, a period rich in disasters, frightful in its wars, torn by civil strife, and even in peace full of horrors. The name Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus has echoed through history not merely as a Roman emperor, but as a byword for tyranny, decadence, and monstrous cruelty. He is the emperor who famously fiddled while Rome burned, the matricide who ordered the execution of his own mother, the grand narcissist who built a colossal golden palace for himself from the ashes of his capital, and the persecutor who scapegoated Christians for a devastating fire, subjecting them to unspeakable torches. This image, meticulously crafted by ancient senatorial historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, and later amplified by Christian apologists, has proven remarkably durable, casting Nero as the archetypal mad tyrant, a murderous psychopath whose reign represents a nadir of Roman morality and governance. However, a closer look at his 14 years in power, from 54 to 68 AD, reveals a figure that is much more nuanced and contradictory. During that time, he had significant periods of effective administration, popular economic policies, and a genuine cultural flourishing that challenged the conservative Roman aristocracy. The question of whether Nero was truly a monstrosity, therefore, demands a nuanced re-evaluation that disentangles the undeniable atrocities of his later years from the promising beginnings of his reign, and that critically interrogates the sources that have so definitively shaped his legacy, asking not only what Nero did, but why his story was written the way it was, and by whom. The traditional narrative of Nero's ascent to power is itself a tale of ambition and murder, orchestrated by his formidable mother, Agrippina the Younger. The 16-year-old adopted son of Emperor Claudius, Nero, succeeded Britannicus, Claudius' biological son, to the throne after the sudden death of Claudius in 54 AD. Agrippina had meticulously orchestrated her son's position through her marriage to Claudius, convincing him to adopt Nero, marry him to his daughter Octavia, and name him heir. Ancient sources, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, are unanimous in attributing Claudius's death to poison. Nero's reign is portrayed as inherently illegitimate and tainted by familial betrayal because he is portrayed as a pawn of his mother's ruthless ambition from the beginning. However, the early years of his rule, also known as the Quinquennium Neroni or the 5 years of Nero, tell a different tale. Nero's government initially pursued a policy of moderation, clemency, and populist reform, guided by his two prestigious advisors, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. He deliberately portrayed himself as a new Augustus, promising to uphold justice and restore the Senate's dignity. In a move that appealed to the senatorial class's desire for due process, he publicly declared that he would not be the judge of every case, curtailing the secret trials intra cubiculum principis that had been a feature of Claudius' reign. His early coins prominently featured an image of the goddess Clementia, and he delivered speeches written by Seneca on the significance of mercy. Economically, Nero's policies were often shrewd and aimed squarely at benefiting the common people, the plebs, which earned him significant popular support. In 58 AD he considered and perhaps implemented a radical reform, the abolition of all indirect taxes throughout the empire. He did significantly reduce a burdensome customs duty, a move specifically intended to encourage trade and commerce, even though the full measure may not have been realized. This policy, while popular with merchants and the lower classes, undoubtedly angered the equestrian and senatorial aristocracy who profited from the existing tax farming system. In addition, he devalued the currency by lowering the amount of silver in the denarius. This is a measure that is recognized by contemporary economists as a practical response to a lack of precious metals and a means of increasing the money supply, facilitating economic activity, even though it led to inflation. He also initiated ambitious public works projects and invested in the infrastructure of the provinces, showing a concern for the empire beyond Rome itself. This early period shows that the ruler was not a monster by nature. Rather, he was a young man trying, with help from wise people, to run the country well and win over the people. The central, defining event of Nero's reign, and the one that irrevocably turned the historical narrative against him, was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, devastating 3 of the city's 14 districts and severely damaging 7 more. According to ancient sources, Nero was away in Antium and returned to organize relief efforts, opening his gardens to the homeless and arranging for food supplies from Ostia to prevent famine. However, they also perpetuate the infamous story that Nero, dressed in theatrical costume, sang of the fall of Troy from a rooftop while watching the city burn, a potent image of a leader completely detached from the suffering of his people. This anecdote, which serves as a perfect metaphor for his alleged narcissism but is likely a later invention, has a highly dubious historical accuracy. Faced with a desperate populace searching for a culprit, Nero needed a scapegoat. He discovered one in the Christians, a small, enigmatic, and unpopular sect. Tacitus, no friend to Christians, recounts with chilling detail how Nero had them rounded up, convicted not so much of arson but of hatred of the human race, and subjected them to horrific public executions. They were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and burned alive to serve as nightly illumination in his gardens. This persecution was a masterstroke of political cynicism, diverting blame and satisfying the mob's bloodlust, but it forever cemented his reputation in Christian tradition as the Antichrist, the first great persecutor of the Church. The fire also provided Nero with a blank canvas for his most grandiose and self-indulgent project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This was more than just a palace. It was also a huge leisure complex with landscaped parks, artificial lakes, and porticos that spanned the entire center of Rome. Its interiors were lavish beyond imagination, adorned with gold leaf, precious stones, and mother-of-pearl, featuring a legendary rotating dining room. To the aristocratic historians, the Domus Aurea was the ultimate symbol of Nero's megalomania, a private palace built on public land, funded by the misery of his subjects, and a monstrous violation of traditional Roman values of moderation and public spirit. It represented the princeps' transformation into a Hellenistic monarch, a god-king who resided in isolated splendor. The treasury was drained by the funding for such projects, the cost of rebuilding Rome, and ongoing fire relief. Nero resorted to desperate measures, raising taxes in the provinces, confiscating the treasures of temples, and most damningly in the eyes of the elite, targeting wealthy senators and equestrians with charges of treason, maiestas, to seize their estates. The ruling class was completely turned against him as a result of this financial theft. The darker aspects of Nero's personality, as reported by the sources, cannot be entirely dismissed as senatorial propaganda. His artistic pretensions were a source of profound scandal for the Roman aristocracy. A Roman emperor was not expected to be a showman, but rather a statesman and a general. However, Nero had a strong interest in acting, poetry, chariot racing, and music. He insisted on performing in public both in Greece and in Rome's specially constructed theaters, requiring attendance from the Senate and equestrian order. And his trio was a profession associated with sexual promiscuity and low social status that required stage performance. For the traditional Roman elite, watching their emperor sing, act, and drive a chariot was not entertainment. It was a humiliating degradation of their office and their dignity. This fundamental clash of cultures occurred. Nero saw himself as a Hellenistic patron of the arts. The Senate saw a debauched narcissist who had abandoned his duty.